Sunday. June 27th, join us for EduPodLoza.
There will be over a dozen EduPodcasters.
Listen for some rhythm and rhyme.
That's a poetry slam, boys and girls.
Roundtable discussion.
Just some teachers talking about teaching and laughing and having a good time.
Role-playing games.
Oh, yeah, for you nerds out there, you know you're gonna like that stuff.
Radio drama.
Dum 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 dum. Ah!
And really funny people.
At least really funny looking, if nothing else. 1 to 9 on June 27th, Eastern Standard Time. We'll be live streaming. There'll be links. We'll put it on the Twitter. We'll make sure that you know where it is. Follow us at Unprocast if you're not already, because that's probably going to be the easiest way to know when it's going live.
June 27th. Free up your calendar now.
Thank you.
Welcome to the Counter Narrative Podcast, a show designed to change the way we talk and think about education. By sharing stories of successes and triumphs, we aim to challenge the dominant narrative that often negatively portrays our disenfranchised populations. I'm your host, Charles Williams, an urban educator for more than 15 years, a current school principal in Chicago, an educational consultant, an equity advocate, and the co-host of Inside the Principal's Office. Let's get started. Before we jump into today's episode, I wanted to tell you about a super exciting event that I have coming up, and I would love for you to be in attendance. As I mentioned in the intro to the show, I am the co-host of Inside the Principal's Office, a web series that runs live on the first and third Saturday of each month. During the show, my co-host Michael McWilliams and I bring on other educational leaders and discuss the most pressing issues and topics facing us today. We also have a Facebook group where educators can connect and learn from each other. Well, this summer, we're planning to host an event where we can get together in person. That's right, not another Zoom or a Google Meet, but live. Even better, it's only $35. So join us in Dallas for a networking reception on Friday, July 30th, followed by a day of activities on Saturday, July 31st. Stop by our Twitter page, join us on Facebook, or check out an upcoming episode for more information. I look forward to finally meeting you. This episode, I chat with fellow codebreaker Christine Ravesi Weinstein, who currently serves as a high school assistant principal in Massachusetts and previously worked as a high school science department chair for 4 years and a classroom teacher for 15. Diagnosed with anxiety and depression at 23, Christine began her journey towards mental wellness. She began a nonprofit organization in June of 2017 aimed at removing the stigma of mental illness and promoting physical activity as a means to cope with anxiety. As an avid writer and educator, Christine became passionate about bridging the two with her advocacy for mental health. Since March of 2019, she has had numerous nationally published articles, including the #1 most read article of 2019 on eSchool News. She also had the #6 and 8 most read articles in that same year. She has also published articles with District Administration, the Teach Better team, Tech and Learning, and Smart Brief. Christine has presented at numerous national conferences and has provided professional development for educators in various districts. Christine is an MASCD board member, author of the book Anxious, published in March of 2020, and a member of the Codebreaker leadership team. Her second book will be out later in 2021. You can follow her work on Twitter and on YouTube, and of course, you could visit her website for more information. During our conversation, we took a deep dive into anxiety and explored ways in which educators can both support students experiencing an anxiety attack, as well as proactive measures to reduce the possibility of triggering them. Christine took the time to explain the difference between being diagnosed with anxiety and being anxious, a common misunderstanding that often leads to misinformation. We also spent some time exploring how social media not only impacts our students, but can and has impacted us as educators as we strive to emulate that which we see in our virtual spaces. As part of our mental awareness efforts, I encourage you to seek assistance if you need it. Like we point out in this episode, conditions such as anxiety are much more common than we realize, and you do not need to suffer in silence or alone. Hello and welcome back to the Counter Narrative Podcast. I am so excited to have you back in this space, but more excited because I have an amazing guest with me. This is an individual that I've been honored and able to connect with in a multitude of spaces, from Twitter chats to the Leadership Lounge to our recent Code Breaker Summit. And so I am speaking than no other than Christine Ravesi Weinstein. And so I am super excited that she's able to come into this space. And so Christine, before we get started, how are you doing today?
I'm doing great, Charles. How are you?
I'm doing
Go
great.
ahead.
I don't. We had a complication earlier, so fingers are crossed that this recording goes a little smoother.
Yeah, I'm sure it's going to go great. Thank you so much for having me and for that awesome introduction. It's humbling. I'm so excited we get to take time away from the larger spaces and just kind of connect one-on-one here.
Yeah, I'll be honest, this is one of my favorite things to do, right? Because in those spaces, we get to be around one another, but it almost feels like we're like passengers on a train, right? And nobody's like, we're flying by, we're so busy, but like now we get to sit down like in a lounge, right? And chill and talk and connect. And so this is one of my favorite things to do.
Yeah. I mean, I love that analogy, passengers on a train. It's so true, right? Like, it's just, we're there, we kind of wave at each other from afar, but like, we don't actually have an opportunity to like sit and have like a normal conversation. So
yeah,
looking forward to it.
So I know that we have shared space together. And so I get, I have this privilege of getting to know you. And I'm guessing, right, that some of my listeners have been familiar with some of your work. But for those who may not know you, would you do me a favor and just go ahead and introduce yourself, share a little bit about who you are, what you do. And as always, I like to hear something interesting about my guests.
All right. So as you said, I'm Christine Ravesi Weinstein. I currently work as an assistant principal at a high school in Massachusetts. This is my third year. I'm about to finish my third year doing that. But it's my 18th year in education. I spent the first 15 as a classroom teacher and a department head. And specifically, I worked in science. So that's kind of what I do during my days. And then, a couple of years ago, I really discovered my passion as a mental health advocate. And, as someone who was diagnosed with anxiety, probably, 18 years ago or so, I've really taken a lot of time to kind of learn about my own diagnosis and what I need for support and what kind of works for me. And through doing that, I've been able to kind of open up about my experience and realize that, one of my coping skills is to help others. And so I've kind of taken this sort of unexpected journey into the land of ed leadership with writing about my experience, connecting it to education in support of students and teachers who are working together to sort of fight mental illness. I'm presenting now. I just was signed by Code Breaker to write my second book. My first one came out right as the pandemic started. So in terms of writing a book about mental health, the timing of it coming out, I guess, couldn't have been more perfect as we were all sort of realizing how much mental health was going to come to the forefront of our lives as a result of the pandemic. And I've just been sort of blessed to be able to connect with so many amazing people like yourself and be able to even have my name in the same sentence as these people. I still look at myself as just this young girl with anxiety, trying to find her way and be comfortable. And so it's kind of miraculous. When I do have a moment to sort of take a step back, I know that I've helped people and influenced them, but I think for me that's sort of like weird because I'm like, I'm just being myself. Like, what's so special about it? So something interesting about me. Whew, I don't know. I mean, I'd like to think that my running regimen and my workout routines are interesting, but I think that that's not really a secret. Like, it's not really a surprise because I do talk a lot about that. So, I would say that something surprising about me, I really like to color. Um,
Hmm.
I've discovered that, like, you know, whether it's sort of like adult coloring books or to sit down with my kiddos and color with them, it's really cathartic and like very relaxing, and really really helps with my anxiety. The problem is I can get completely lost in it, and like hours go by. So that's something interesting. I don't really talk about it. It's not something I'm going to like post about, you know, or anything like that. So I'd say that's something that's kind of interesting about me.
Awesome. Awesome. Yeah, I was going to say the running, definitely. I live vicariously through you through the running. I'm not a runner. So I've been like, every time you post like pictures of you running, I'm like, yeah, thank you for doing that for us. I appreciate it.
Yeah, I saw this funny like a meme, or I don't know what you want to call it, but like a quote that someone had posted that said like, I used to spend so much time like marveling at people I would see running down the street, and now I am that person, right? So like I know people are looking at me like, oh my god, why do they run, or I can't run, or whatever. But you know, I used to be someone that would see people running and was like, oh my god, I should do that. But I was like, why would I? And now I do. So I don't know. It's weird how it's come kind of full circle. So
Well, I've been very tempted to start, one of those threads because I know you guys like you do the run and rants and they're
yes,
great, right?
yes,
You're running
yeah,
and you're processing. And I
yeah.
was like, I'm going to start one like meandering and mindfulness. Like I'm just going
There
to
you go.
wander,
Yes.
leisurely
That's a great one.
stroll.
You should are you a part of the Walking Eds?
You know what? I am part. I don't know. I don't know how I operate like this. I'm part of like everything, but
Right.
not part of anything.
Okay.
Um, but yeah, so when we do take our walks, I hate the cold, and so the fact like the
Oh, me
warm is
too.
coming, like I will start walking again, and then I become a walking ed, but
There
only
you
when it's
go.
warm out.
Yeah, no, hey, I hear you. Maybe that should have been my interesting fact is I can't stand the cold, and my son's sport is hockey. So it's like
Oh,
literally the worst in terms of like what my body prefers, is sitting in a freezing cold rink 4 or 5 times a week. But you know, you do anything for your kids. So I'm quickly getting accustomed to it.
yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And I know you have the one little one, right?
I have two little ones
Two
actually.
little
So
ones.
yeah, well, my 7-year-old doesn't seem so little anymore, and then he's the hockey player, and then I have a 4-year-old little girl who is just a diva. So hopefully she'll find an activity other than being a diva soon.
Yeah, and hopefully it doesn't involve the cold, right?
Well, she's in skating lessons right
Oh.
now, so I don't know what I did to deserve this. I
Uh,
played basketball in the winter, but I guess I'm
yeah, yeah. I don't know.
lucky.
I've told my wife that I would do hot yoga just so I could be like
Ooh,
in the warm. Not that I was
yes,
going to stretch, just I was going to sit there in the heat.
there you go.
But
That's awesome.
oh,
Yeah, no, I tell people like I am happy when my body is like a nice, not humid 75 degrees. And like in Massachusetts, we get that maybe 2 weeks a year. So I'm
mm.
not living in the right place.
Well, Christine, like I said earlier, right? I feel already, right, just within the like less than 10 minutes that we've been talking, I feel like I know you so much better.
Yeah.
Um, but I know there's also going to be so much more to learn from you. And so you mentioned a little earlier that you have been doing a lot of work around mental health, especially focusing on anxiety. And I would be remiss to point out that this episode is dropping right at the end of May, which is the end of Mental Health Awareness Day.
Hmm.
Um, but what I love about this in hindsight is that a lot of people will listen to this past May.
Right.
And so it is still keeping that conversation going outside of the so-called dedicated month so that way we could continue having these conversations. And I say that about so
Mm-hmm.
many topics. So I'm really happy that we're doing this when we're doing it.
Yeah, no, I think it's, there's so much about timing. Like everything in life is about timing. And in addition to it being Mental Health Awareness Month, having gotten to a point in this pandemic where we're sort of crawling out of it.
Mhm.
I think we're sort of looking beyond the virus itself, and now we're kind of looking at the fallout. And mental health is a huge fallout, as you know, as a result of everything that we've kind of gone through in the last 14 or 15 months. So I think in terms of that timing, it's more than appropriate for it to come out now too.
So let's jump in. I'm curious. I know that you do a lot of work around anxiety, and I think, and we've talked on this show before, I think it's one of those things that maybe be misunderstood. And I know you do a lot of work with teachers for them to better understand their students or even themselves, and helping students better cope and understand.
Mhm.
So can you share with me maybe some of the work that you're doing to maybe change the narrative around this idea of mental health and maybe even just anxiety in particular?
Yeah, that's an awesome question because I think people when they ask a question like that, they almost look for like a bulleted list of like, well, I do this, 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 and this. And what I've really discovered, I've been kind of doing this now for about 2 years, going on 3 years now, writing and speaking. What I've really discovered and what, I get emotional even just thinking about it is that the most powerful thing that I can do for others is to just share your story, right? Because the thing about anxiety specifically is that that you're feeling a certain way, you feel like you're so damned different, and you don't know, like you look around the world and you're like, wow, it seems so easy for these people. But what you don't realize is that so many people feel the way that you do. And it's about having sort of the courage. And I'm not saying I'm the only courageous person. There are millions of courageous people that do wonderful things every day. For a lot of us, it could just be getting up in the morning. But to have the courage to sort of stand up as someone who's seen as like normal and highly functional, right? To stand up and be like, no, this is what I went through. This is what I still go through. And this is what is normal. That's how you kind of shed that stigma. And so, the greatest compliments I get are about my authenticity and about how it's like, I'm me and this is my story. There's really nothing special about my story, right? Like when you really boil it down, my story is ordinary, but that's why people relate to it. Right.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's opening up that door and saying like, this is who I am. This is my story. And people are like, oh my God, like it doesn't have to be as difficult as I make it in my head. And I think people sort of appreciate that. They can take a deep breath and let their shoulders relax a little bit. And it's like me letting people know that I'm going to carry the burden with them, like they're not alone. And so that's the very first thing that I do with all of my work. I did it at the Codebreaker Summit. I spend the first 15 minutes just trying to connect to my audience and share who I am. And not even who I am on a professional level, but who I am on a personal level, an emotional level. And then once I get there, it's like, I feel like I can build trust with the audience. And then it's like, okay, now that we've gotten that out of the way and you know me a little better, here are some basic strategies, like just some real, real simple things. And I think it lands better. And people are like, wow, this isn't so hard. Like I don't have to do anything grandiose. And that's the approach that I have. And, thus far in this very sort of, early journey that I've been on, it seems to be working. And so I'm going to stick with it.
Well, I definitely want to say, I appreciate the authenticity. It is something that we discuss a lot in these spaces. There are a lot of voices, right? These platforms that we find ourselves in, lend itself to the voices of many. And sometimes we wonder the information we're receiving or hearing, the authenticity behind it. And so I definitely want to say thank you for that. I remember sitting there and watching listening to your story, and it was like, wow, the vulnerability. I think that you were just like, this is who I am. And it's like, wow, most people would not share that. Right. So
Yeah.
I just want to say thank you for that.
Well, you are more than welcome. And, you know, it's just hearing those little things, the comments that you made, the appreciation that you expressed that keep me not just sort of fighting every day, but keep me being like, this does make a difference, and, you know, keeps fueling the courage that I have and the vulnerability I'm willing to present, to keep sharing my story.
So, Christina, I'd love to ask, you know, as a father dealing, you know, with his own children, and dealing with anxiety, you know, it's a learning process for me as well, and so I think it's no different for educators with you know, students in their spaces. So, can I ask you, what are some of the most common misconceptions, as you've been doing this work around, you know, the idea of anxiety, you know, that people have about what it is and what it isn't? Can you shed a little bit of light on that, so that way maybe those of us who are struggling to understand, you know, can get a better idea?
So there's two misconceptions that I talk a lot about. The first is that everybody has anxiety. That's not true at all. Not everybody has anxiety. Everyone feels anxious sometimes, but not everyone feels anxiety. So, like, let me try to give you an example. So the other day I'm at work, and it's the end of the day, and literally out of nowhere, I'm sitting there. There's probably 20 minutes left in the day, and I'm like, I'm going to burst into tears. I'm gonna have a meltdown. Like, I could feel it coming. And it's this moment where you're like, why? Like, you know, you'd assume like someone's going to burst into tears. Like there was something that immediately precipitated that, right? Nope. So, you know, I managed to find the strength to get through 20 minutes. I get back to my office. I literally pack my bag up, open the door, tell my administrative assistant, I'm out. I got to go. See ya. Didn't even ask if it was okay if I left early. And I barely remember my drive home because I was just an emotional wreck. It comes out of nowhere, but it's this constant feeling of worry that you're fighting all of the time about no one thing in particular, where you get to a place where you just are tired of fighting it and you let it all out. That's not typical, right? I might, you know, run a road race and I'm anxious about the start of the road race, right? But like, what's going to happen once the road race starts? I'm not going to feel that anymore, right? But the experience I had the other day was like, there was no one thing I could say, well, it's this or it's that. It was just this general feeling of overwhelmed worry and sort of panic. So that's what anxiety is. The other thing that's a common misconception is that nervousness and anxiety are the same thing, and they're not. They're not the same thing at all, right? You know, I would be in high school, remember needing to take a test. And before the test started, I would be very nervous. I'd have butterflies in my stomach, right? And then once I started taking the test, like that would sort of calm itself down. It was the same thing before a basketball game, you know, standing on the foul line, hearing the national anthem, being nervous about the start of the game. The game starts, you're not nervous anymore. Anxiety, again, is out of nowhere. There's no one thing you can put your finger on. And it's more sort of generalized, overwhelmed feeling. Those are two really important things for people to understand, because when we say things like, well, everyone gets anxious, or, you know, yeah, I'm nervous too, it minimizes what the person's experiencing. It minimizes what they're feeling. And it also takes that person and they're like, well, I don't understand why they're still feeling this way, because I get nervous too, or I get anxious too, and it goes away, right? And so it makes you're creating a disconnect between yourself and the sufferer. So those are two huge things. They're very like foundational when it comes to anxiety to understand in order to be supportive of somebody who's suffering from it.
So would you have, and I know this is typically something I ask towards the end of it, but it just lends itself to this portion of the conversation. If I'm an educator and I have a student in my class who is seemingly having this emotional response, right, out of nowhere, I'm not sure what's happening, and if it may be, right, some form of anxiety attack, what are some of the best things that I can do in that moment as an educator? You know, obviously you mentioned like, don't minimize the emotions, right. Don't like, you know, so I'm just curious, what could I as an educator do to help a student in that position?
So the first thing you want to do is not draw everyone's attention to it. You want to try to address it sort of as subtly as possible. And I know that might sound kind of crazy if someone's in the middle of your classroom having a meltdown, whether it's crying or, maybe they're shaking, whatever. But the best thing that you can do is you need to go support that student by walking up to them and saying, hey, let's go take a minute together, right? Now, the most ideal thing would be if that teacher could walk out of the classroom sort of with the student and get them out of the environment and then have a conversation. Obviously, you can't do that if you're supposed to be the adult in the room. So if I'm in that situation, I'm going to go to the classroom next door. I'm going to let the teacher know, hey, I need to leave the classroom for a minute. Can you keep an eye on my kids? I imagine the teacher's going to say, sure, because that's how teachers are, right? Then I'm going to walk up hopefully I'm going to, walk up to the kid and just say, hey, let's go for a walk real quick, and to get the kid out of my classroom. So in a place where they don't have to worry about being looked at, right? Because that's going to exacerbate what they're feeling. And then when I'm out in the hall or, walking with them, I'm just going to listen. I'm going to say, hey, what's going on? What can I do to support you right now? What do you need from me? That's providing a student with means to self-advocacy, right? Self-advocacy is everything. We need to produce students who can advocate for themselves, but people don't seem to understand what that means. No kid with anxiety is going to sit in your classroom, raise their hand and be like, I'm anxious, I can't do this, right? That's just not the way it's going to be because they're too anxious to do that. So what we need to do is empower them to advocate. We do that by asking them questions. We do that by saying, what can I do for you? By creating a platform where they're comfortable saying what they need, because they're not going to do it unsolicited. So that's what I would do for that student, talk to them, figure out what it is that they need, and then you'd be able to implement some sort of a strategy. One of the biggest things we do mistakenly when we're trying to support a student with anxiety is we make an assumption about what they need. Right? Because when someone's suffering, it can make us nervous, oh my God, I'm not sure how to deal with this. And anytime something's making us uncomfortable, what's the first thing we want to do? We want to remove that, right? This is making me uncomfortable. I don't want to do, you don't like the cold, right? So if you're in the cold, what are you going to do? I got to get somewhere warm. I don't want to be around this. It's uncomfortable. And so that's a lot of times what educators do. There's a student who's in need and they're like, oh, I'll just call someone else to deal with it because they don't want to deal with it. They're uncomfortable. And rightfully so. I get it. But what we need to do is we need to put our discomfort aside and do what we have to support that kid. It's really simple. Ask them some questions. Let them know you're there for them. Let them tell you what they need, and then do your best to provide that for them.
That's awesome.
You're welcome.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm sitting here taking notes. And, as I mentioned, as a leader, right, you're in those spaces. So I've had teachers, right, staff members, who have found themselves in these, and you're right, you're kind of sitting there what do I do?
Yeah.
Right.
Yep.
So I appreciate that.
Yep.
So, I guess it's nice to know how to react to these situations.
Right.
I'm curious, with the work that you do with educators, what are some of the things that, we can do to be proactive, to create spaces where, it may not be, a source of anxiety, or when those moments hit, that it will be conducive to allowing the students, to kind of process what's happening. So do you have any suggestions there?
Yeah. So there are many, many things that you can actually do to be proactive when it comes to anxiety in your classroom. So the first thing you need to do is be very routinized as an educator, right? So what's going to make kids anxious is environments that are unpredictable, because anxiety is a disease about control. And so the more control that a student can have over their environment, the less anxious they're going to feel. And they really don't have control over their classroom, right? The teacher does. So if the teacher can be as highly predictable as possible, it's going to reduce that student's anxiety. So for me, I was so routinized in my teaching that kids never had to worry, when is this? They could tell me when things were going to be due. Oh, this is a lab. You give us 3 nights. So it's due Thursday. Yep. Okay. So they knew, right? Like my units were structured the exact same way. We did the exact same number of days of notes, the exact same number of days of lab activity and work. I gave them weekly agendas instead of daily. So they knew on Monday what was going to be due next Monday. Like it was so structured that kids with anxiety in my classroom were highly successful. The other thing that I did was that I was very flexible. And so what that meant for me was like on tests and assessments, like I'd grade it the first time, but then I would sit with kids after the fact and we would go back through the test and it would actually earn them points. So it took away that anxiety they would have about this sort of high stakes exam, because what they understood was that I cared more about them gaining the knowledge in the end, regardless of whether they had it on, May 26th when we took the test. So that's another thing that you can do. Also providing kids with structured notes. So I taught AP students and I handed them out note packets, right? So I get really frustrated when I go into classes and like the teachers just lecture and the kids are there with like a blank notebook. Like, where do they start? How do they know what to do, right? Like, it's not really the college experience. My college experience, there was always like some skeletal something for me to kind of build my notes off of. So I made sure I did that all the time. I mean, a lot of IEP accommodations require that teachers provide sort of like, foundational notes for kids. I did it for everybody, right? Like it's good practice. Those are like, I mean, I could keep going on and on, but I would say that those are, 3 of the really most important things you can do right from the get-go. And that's going to kind of relax your anxious students because they're going to be in a predictable environment.
I like the last thing you said there, the idea that this is listed in an IEP, so I'll do it for you. But it's like, wait, if it's effective for you, then why would it not be effective for others, right? Like, why do I need to put this down on a legal document in order for you to give me a best practice? Like,
well, yeah, because if you think about it, and I'm not trying to minimize the accommodations or, the things that students with IEPs struggle with, but we could write an IEP for everyone. There's something we all struggle with. There's something we all have difficulty with. It might not be a specific learning disability, but there's something in all of our lives that's going to hinder our ability to be successful. It's just whether or not we can provide our own accommodations for ourselves or if we need additional support. So you really have to approach every kid that way, right? Like, okay, you don't have an actual written IEP, but there's something in your life that's going to be a challenge for you to be successful, right? And so our job as educators is to pave the neatest path possible for every single student to be successful. And, like if you're struggling with one kid, why not look at the accommodations in an IEP? This works for this kid. Let me give it a try, right? Or let me ask the kid what they might need. And so I'm a firm believer in that we can't look at our classroom as this sort of blanket of, okay, I got to get through this curriculum. This is how I'm going to do it. It's got to be more. These kids need to learn this. How are they going to learn it? And I think, that empowers the students and especially those with anxiety, right?
Yeah. It's the other day, one of my educators came to me and, he proposed this. He said, what if next year we do like IEPs? I was like, well, we already do IEPs. Like, what are you talking about? Right. He's like, no. For everyone. Like, what if we gave everyone an IEP? And I was like, well, I mean, if you're the one who wants to mention this to teachers in the paperwork, like, be my guest. Right. But I said, but you're absolutely right. It's the concept behind it of identifying what students need and, making sure that everybody has it, regardless of a document saying that they do, right? Just because that is our job as educators, like you mentioned, right? Just we're going to give students what they need in order to be successful.
Yeah, absolutely. That's why we got into this profession, right?
Yes. Well, and I hope
I mean, that and summers off, but like,
Wait, you get summers
No,
off?
not as an administrator. And I think all educators know you don't really get summers off.
Absolutely not. I know some of them are like, "Hey, wait a minute,
Yeah,
guys."
yeah,
Like,
yeah,
no, 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 no.
yeah.
We we
Yes.
jest. Oh, well, Christine, I mean, this has been an amazing conversation so far. Just I know for me, it has shed some light into the idea of how do you deal with an individual, and I shouldn't say deal,
Yeah.
support. That is a better word. How do you support someone who is suffering from
Yeah.
anxiety? I'll be honest, when it has happened, I kind of sit in my office and stare at them blankly, like and it's like I'm hoping that I'm giving you space to process, and then more often than not, it's like thank you, and then they leave, and it's like you're
Yeah, like what
welcome.
did I do, right? Like I didn't do anything. I sat here awkwardly for 15 minutes.
Yeah, yeah. I sat in that
Yeah.
awkwardness, as you mentioned, but it's it I will say that it has given me some insights, and will help me to think about this in a different way, and I'm hoping it does the same, with those listening to this, whether they themselves are experiencing this, understanding that, you're not alone, right? There are a lot of others, and I wanted to come back to that idea of redefining what courage is and redefining what normalcy is. We get very caught up in what we should be doing or
Mhm.
what we should be able to do. And when we're unable to meet these self-created
Mhm.
standards of right living, right?
Yeah,
Like,
I'm glad you said the word should because I like to say that should is the most dangerous word in the English language. Really, really is. Because you know what you should do? What it is you want to do. That's what you should be doing,
there you
right?
go.
Like, and I try so hard to eliminate that from my vocabulary. It's difficult. It's so, so, so damn difficult, right? Like, right down to simple things like I'm lounging on the couch watching Netflix, and in my head, I'm like, oh, I should fold that laundry. Damn it. No, I should be doing this because this is what I need right now. Right. But like, so it can be that simple. It can be as complex and deep seated as, you know, I should be doing what they're doing, right? Like going on social media, that's like the worst place. And, I see moms meal prepping on Sundays and I'm like, oh, I should be doing that, right? Like comparing myself to others. That just is like, putting gasoline on an anxiety fire that's already burning way too hot, right? So, like, that word is so, so, so dangerous for so many people. It's terrible.
And I'm glad you mentioned this because I was going to try to see if we could touch on it, and since you have, it's perfect. Um, and it is that idea of social media,
Yeah.
right? I think when some of us were younger, you know, we had no idea what was happening in the world around us,
None.
right? Like
None at all.
things were happening, and we're like, all right, cool. I'm oblivious, right? I'm happy with my stick and
Yeah,
my
you lived in your
whatever,
little bubble, right? Your little yeah.
right?
Yep. Yeah.
So I was just going to ask, like, what is your position? I, I think when it comes to social media, whether it's for educators or for students, if you have any advice there, but I think the other side of that is, as an educator, we know that students are constantly being bombarded, if not constantly, diving into the worlds of other individuals, these really falsehoods, right? Because they're not, half the time they're not real.
Yes.
Um, so how do we help students or ourselves even, I think, to navigate those spaces and to be okay between the wants and shoulds and these are my actual needs?
Yeah, so I think it's a lot easier for adults because we have a perspective that young kids don't. I mean, I think that it's really, really important to limit kids' use of social media. I know that, as a parent myself, it's the easiest thing when like I need time to, just throw a screen at them and say like, go occupy your time or whatever. I'm guilty of that, right? But I'm not so worried about the influence that, the silly little games my son plays on his iPad are going to have on him. What I'm worried about is actual social media. So things he's seeing other people post about themselves. So we really, really need to set limits on that. The other thing we need to do is we got to get our kids involved in something outside of, tablets and whatever the case may be. That's huge. It's so, so important. Like their hobbies can't be being on social media. I mean, one of the most discouraging things that I experience, when you're doing sort of like an IEP meeting or whatever the case may be, and you ask the kid, like, so what do you want to do after school or whatnot? And they're like, well, I want to be TikTok famous. Like, what? Like, that's a thing? Like, I don't get it. Like, and I think as adults, it's really, really important we talk to our kids about what they're seeing on social media, right? It can't just be this kind of vacuum that they're living in where they're seeing images that are creating these emotional responses that they don't have conversations about. I mean, one of the most impactful books that I read was What Made Maddie Run. And it's basically this book that sort of exemplifies exactly what you're asking about. It's a young high school girl that was an elite runner. She went to an Ivy League school on a scholarship to run track. For all intents and purposes, on the outside, she was what everybody would deem, beautiful and successful and had the perfect life. And on the inside, she was fighting anxiety and depression that, I don't want to minimize it, but that was really fueled by what she was seeing as other people's happiness on social media, because inside she didn't feel happy, right? And she'd post these pictures that were filtered that would portray herself as happy, but it's not how she felt. And the reason she kept posting these pictures was because she was like, well, everyone else is so happy. And the long and short of the story is she ended up taking her own life. And Kate Fagan is the author. She writes for ESPN. You might have heard of her. And she did lengthy research about Maddie and looked at her journals, and her family gave her very intimate access into her life. And what she discovered was that social media was really sort of the catalyst for her deep depression that ended up taking her life. And I read that book, I don't know, a couple of years ago, sort of at the start of my own sort of mental health advocacy journey. And it really, has made a lasting impression on me about how toxic social media is to our young people, and how their value and their own self-worth is based on what they perceive someone else's happiness to be. It's just so sad. It's so tragic. We've got to create young people that value themselves, and they take pride in who they are and their own accomplishments, and they don't compare themselves to others. And that really has to be adult influence. It really has to be. There's really no other way we can do it. And so again, we've got to make ourselves uncomfortable, right? We've got to be like, I really could use some me time, but maybe my kid shouldn't be on social media right now. I'm going to engage with them instead. We just got to make a commitment to ourselves and our young kids. And it's not easy.
I find an interesting, I guess, juxtaposition, if you will, right? This idea that we want to celebrate our students and for them to be proud of who they are. And I think we see this so often, right? Then we, as educators, we do that through celebrating them on social media.
Right.
Like the very space that we're like, no, stay away because it can be extremely toxic. But I'm also going to use that exact same space to promote you. And it's like, I really think that we need to be cognizant of just as educators, how we're utilizing it, because I know for a fact, right, that there are the exact same scenario that you mentioned. There are educators, right, who do the same thing, who look at others and they're like, wow, you're so amazing as an educator. Wow, you're doing such great things. And it's like, you have no clue who that person is. Right. But yet you are trying to emulate your life or your classroom or your trajectory off of this person. And it's like, no, because if we're doing it, we're teaching our students and our children that that's okay. And yeah.
So, like, sort of two thoughts on that. the first being, when we post and we celebrate about our kids, it's less of a celebration of our child and it's more of a look at me, right? Like that's on the adult, right? Like
Mm.
it's
Mm.
it's so much less about I'm proud of my kid and more about like, it's the same thing as like the bumper sticker that's like my middle school student is an honor roll student. Like nobody really cares. Like I know that's going to sound horrible and there's going to be someone watching this that's like, that's so rude. Why would you say that? But like that sticker's made for you to feel better about yourself. So like
Mm-hmm.
once we understand that about ourselves, like it's okay if you want to post that, but just understand what you're really doing, right? Like
Mm-hmm.
that is sort of the first thing. The second thing about what you just said is one of the things that I've learned since making the move from the classroom to being an administrator. So as a department head, I had evaluative ability. So I've been evaluating other educators for 7 years now. So I've gotten a pretty decent amount of experience, and it's really amazing the perspective I now have, because I remember being a classroom teacher and there were the colleagues of mine that talked so much about teaching and the art of it and pedagogy and the science behind it. And well, I do this in my classroom. I do that in my classroom. I do this in my classroom. They'd be constantly posting on Twitter, this, that, and the next thing. And I'd be sitting there like, damn, like I must suck. Like I thought I was doing a good job in my classroom, but like, I'm not doing all those things, right? And it would make me feel
Mm-hmm.
bad about myself. Then all of a sudden, I'm an evaluator and I'm going into that person's classroom, right? And I'm like, I don't get it. What's so great about this? And so what I've come to discover is that the loudest people are not the best educators. And it's
Mm.
the silent teachers, they're silently crushing it. It's the person that is not posting all the time about what they're doing per se. It's the person that's not boasting about what their kids are accomplishing. You go into their classroom and you're like, holy crap, this teacher's crushing it. And no one knows about it. And it's like the same idea as the social media dilemma, right? It's like people are boasting about themselves on social media and you're like, oh my God, that person has the perfect life, but they probably don't. It's probably to make up for a deficit. And it's sort of a similar concept in education. I'm not saying this is the case across the board. There are some people that post a lot and do a lot of work and are very vocal and they're fabulous educators. But in my experience, just in terms of like my own buildings that I've worked in, this has been my experience. And for me, coming to that conclusion has really helped my own confidence and has helped me realize that it's not about what others think. It's about how I feel. And when I go to bed at night, am I like, yeah, I did great today. Like my kids were satisfied with that. I did right by my students today, or I did right by my faculty. Then I don't care like to necessarily have to yell or scream about it. So I think they go hand in hand.
No, absolutely, I agree. And I always say in these episodes, right? Like, if you're here to sit and be comfortable, like you're listening to the wrong show. So I always like it when we hit upon a topic that, there are people are like, yeah, say it again, right? And then there are others like, what do you mean,
Right.
right? So, but I think we're absolutely right, and the idea here is not to necessarily condemn anyone, right? That's not our purpose, but it's to be really understanding and reflectful on understanding that there are people out there who are just talking to talk, right?
Mm-hmm.
But regardless of what it is, do not compare yourself to what you see. Like, if you want to gain ideas, if you want to become inspired, that's great. And that is really why I think most of us are in these spaces. But do not compare yourself. Do not, judge yourself based on these standards that you're creating off of the Instagram or the Pinterest or the Twitter spaces, because you don't have that full picture. And so just like we're telling students, and I like how we are using this as an administrative teaching moment, right?
Yep.
Like just the same way that we tell students as educators, like, don't do that to yourself. And even us as administrators, like, don't do that to ourselves. Like we really have to be cognizant. So I'm really glad we went down that pathway. I appreciate it.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, we are, I think, coming to a close here. And so before I close out, I am sure that people listening are like, this woman is phenomenal. I
you.
want to be able to connect with her. Not to compare myself, but to connect and to see some of the amazing things that she's doing, so that way we could learn and grow together. So can you share how people might be able to find you, and of course plug your book so they can find that as well?
Absolutely. So people can follow me on Twitter at Ravesi Weinstein. I guarantee you I'm the only one. I have like the longest, most convoluted last name ever. So as frustrating as it is to spell, it actually does help me sometimes. You can also go to my website, which is just Ravesi Weinstein, no hyphen.com. And you can learn all about my latest blogs and vlogs and books and whatnot on my website. But and that's it. I really just use Twitter. Like it's we just talked about social media. It's just like it's like another job, right? Like I just don't have like I'm an administrator. I do my other professional work. I'm a mom. I like to run. Like I just can't do more than that. But so the book that I've already had published through Times 10 Publications is called Anxious: How to Advocate for Students with Anxiety, because what if it turns out right? And you can go on my website to learn how to purchase that. It's a book that doesn't just sort of share stories about examples of people dealing with anxiety, but it's really a book of strategies. So I've had people read it and say, I'm a teacher, it was helpful. I've had administrators read it and say it was helpful. I've had parents read it and say like, wow, this was really impactful for me with my child who's suffering. And then my second book is still being written right now. I'm approaching like the 2/3 mark of the book, which is exciting for me. It's a very, very different field. It's through Codebreaker, and as proud as I am of my first book, I feel like this book through Codebreaker is going to kind of be my book. So it's all about fighting your inner voice. That's the working title right now. And it's a book that has sort of taken on a lot of different forms as I've written it. It started out as a book that was going to be about how to lead through anxiety when you're fighting your own anxiety. And then I got the idea to interview others. And it's now become a book that is really like a lot of other people's stories, fighting their own inner voice. And I've learned so much. It's some people, like the stories they've shared with me are so unbelievably powerful and so moving that it's a book that's hard to write. Like I need to work on it, and then I need to take a step back because it's become really an emotional experience for me. And I'm really excited about the prospect of bringing this to others and having it be as impactful for them as it has been for me writing it. And so hopefully I'll have it done by the end of the summer, and it will be out in the fall would be my goal. But I'm just so lucky to have joined the Codebreaker team because they're a group that want you to write your book. And I really feel like this is my book. This is my story. This is others' stories that I want to get out there. And I'm so excited to finally finish it and have other people dive in.
Yeah. The Codebreaker team has been an amazing group to interact with. So
yeah, I'm so, it's been awesome, and I'm so excited.
Well, Christina, I cannot say thank you enough for everything that you are doing. Through the work you're doing in schools, through the work that you're doing around mental health, for being in social media and in spaces like this. Just really, again, being authentic and telling your story, and just really shedding a light onto things that we normally misunderstand, and we really need to do better. So I just want to say thank you. And
thank you. I just want to say, you're thanking me for sharing my story and, trying to help and support others, but it's really you that needs to be thanked because you're allowing for the space to give us the chance to do this. And we're not going to make any headway on this endeavor if not for those willing to take the risk and give us a chance to talk about it. So thank you so much for allowing me to come on here and to try to reach your audience. I really do appreciate it. And so do all the other people out there who can relate to this and are suffering too, it matters to them as well. So thank you.
Well, thank you. I appreciate you, and I look forward to continue our connections in other spaces.
Absolutely.
I want to thank you for listening to the Counter Narrative Podcast. If you're enjoying the show, please be sure to like, subscribe, and of course, share it with friends and family. I'd also love to hear your thoughts about the show, so please leave a comment or two as well. Now, I'm not sure what platform you're using, but the show can be found on Anchor, Google Podcast, Apple Podcast, Spotify, and plenty of other platforms. If the show isn't on your preferred site, let me know, and I'll be sure to get it up and running. This podcast is also featured on schoolrubric.com, where you can find educational articles, videos, and interviews with educators from around the globe. Be sure to connect with me and other listeners by following the show on Twitter at the CN Podcast and joining the show's Facebook group. Take care.